This video is all about zinnias. Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. Again, this video is all about zinnias. Zinnias are one of the main go-to pollinator plants for our garden that we use each and every summer. They go in after our average last frost date, which is around April 15th, and they perform, for the most part, amazingly well during the summer, and we'll talk about different varieties and how they perform a little later in the video. They are native to grasslands in North America and down into South America, and they're all truly annuals. You know, some of the things we use in the garden have some that are annuals and some that are perennials, some different species within the same, but zinnias are going to all be annuals in your garden. They're going to grow and perform like crazy for one season, and then they're going to come out at the end of that season. You can collect seed on them. Zinnia is a genus within Asteraceae, or the aster family. The aster family is one of the largest, if not the largest, plant family on Earth. They all produce what we call composite flowers, and so what you'll see in a zinnia is the bigger thing we call a flower is actually made up of very, very small flowers and lots of them, and each of those get pollinated and produce seed. So asters are very good at producing seed. Zinnias come in sizes from 6 inches in height up to 48 inches in height, and we use various ones for various things here in the garden. There's not only a height difference, there's also differences within the flowers. So you'll get flowers that are singles, meaning it's just a flat ray of petals around the outside of the flower, or doubles, semi-doubles, and even spidery looking flowers. Zinnias definitely thrive in the full sun, and it's best to put them in full sun with good air movement. They can do okay in part shade, but they tend to have more issues with some fungal problems that we'll talk a little more about later in the video. So we have lots of uses for zinnias here in our garden. We use the smaller growing dwarf varieties along bed edges, right out along. You can use them to soften things like angular sidewalks and things like that, where they'll come out on it just a bit. We do that on our garden paths here. We use the larger ones behind other perennial borders because the foliage on the bottom of them is not necessarily the best. So if they're behind, the larger growing ones are behind something, the flowers stick up big and tall and are showy up above your other flowering things. We can use them in containers, and of course they're drawing in pollinators, hummingbirds, just butterflies, are visiting them during the summer, and so we want them out in spaces where we can see them from, again, right here on the screen porch, or if we're coming out into the front garden, we can sit on our front porch, on our front stoop, and see them out in front of us. So we don't tuck them up against the house. We have them out in the garden where we can observe the pollinators visiting. We start our zinnia seed indoors about 4 weeks before our average last frost date. So our average last frost date's right around April 15th. And here we are, March 20th is when we're starting our zinnia seeds. They actually come up very readily from seed, 3 to 7 days, something like that. So you're going to know whether your zinnia seed's good really, really quickly. And you'll have a chance to redo them if there is something, the seed's old or whatever, because they come up so quickly. So it's about 4 weeks in the trays. So we're using a 50 cell tray that we're doing in the house with a seed starting mix under a light. Zinnias can be direct seeded out into the garden, and you probably, with some bed prep that I'll talk about in a minute, you can do them directly in the garden. We find that we get the best performance from starting them in the house in this 50 cell tray. Again, any seed starting method you want to use. So if you want to use milk jugs outside, literally any way you want to go about starting your seeds, zinnias are a good entry into seed because, again, they come up readily. All they need is good bright light initially, and then again after April 15th we'll plant them out into the garden, or they could again be direct seeded out into the garden at that time. Our prep for our annuals out here is, we add some compost to the beds each time. We have a clay-based soil, and we have, over the course of 3 years, added compost several times to the areas in which we grow our annual flowering things. and those beds have gotten better and better. So if you're doing it the first year, you're making a new annual bed, you're putting in some compost and you're prepping it, those are probably not going to be the best flowering annuals you're going to have that first year, but over time you can really find that you can break that soil up and create a space where your annual flowers like zinnias perform really well. So again, I'm starting them about four weeks before my average last frost date. They'll go into the ground after April 15th, and we'll still be looking at the 10-day forecast to make sure there's no cold coming. These being true annuals, they do not want any frost on them whatsoever. We definitely want to avoid frost. These will stay in the house for about 3 weeks. They'll come up in a week, stay under the light for another 2 weeks, and then we'll transfer them out into the sun to acclimate them to the full sun. Even though the light rack is very bright, it's definitely not as bright as the full sun outside. So they'll spend about 3 hours out in the full sun initially, and then 5 hours, and then 8 hours, and then they'll go into the ground at that point. Before we go through how we maintain our zinnias out in the garden, I figured I would go through the ones that we're actually starting from seed. So there are main two groups of zinnias. One is Zinnia elegans. This is in lots and lots of named varieties. These are going to be the larger growing ones. Here in the southeast, we can get some powdery mildew issues on them. We can get zinnia blight on them, which is a spotting on the leaf later in the summer. And they have a slightly shorter season than some of the smaller growing ones I'm about to talk about, but they're worth having because they're 48 inches tall and they put on this grand show for several weeks. We have lots of Zinnia elegans varieties, and so we do some that are just like formal doubles, like this giant double Violet Queen, and then we do the Binnery series, which tend to be a little more disease resistant, or they were bred to be more disease resistant. I haven't actually found that to be necessarily 100% true. We still get some blight on those. We don't get as much powdery mildew because we're selecting a place out in the garden that gets good air movement. It's an important thing about placement beyond full sun is good air movement is very, very important as well. We have a variety of elegans called Pinka, one called Parks Pink Lilac that we did last year, very beautiful, like a light lavender purple double, and one called Giant Double Flowered Lavender. Great varieties. And then we have some specialty Salvia elegans, or Zinnia elegans, that we do as well. We have one called Pink Senorita, and that one's from Baker Creek. And we do some of the others from Baker Creek. We do the Queen series. We have Queen Lime Red, Queen Lime. These were in the garden last year. Just a lime-colored giant zinnia on like a 36-inch stalk. Just absolutely beautiful, interesting flower. Pollinators love. Pollinators slept on those last year. And one called Queen Lime's Blush. May not actually be the showiest one in the world, but it's one of the more interesting flowers in our garden. That within this seed pack, we'll have 20 different looking blush-colored flowers, which is really kind of interesting. So from there, Zinnia elegans, being the larger growing ones, with the showiest flowers, have been bred with angustifolia, which are dwarf zinnias. And the dwarf zinnias did not have the showy of flowers, but combining the two, plant breeders have been able to put the extremely showy flowers of Zinnia elegans with the compact, disease-resistant Zinnia angustifolia. And what we have is a couple series that we use. One is called Profusion and one is called Zahara. And they're absolutely fantastic. Pretty much every one of these that we've tried in the garden have been great garden performers. These are the plants that are getting 6 to 8 inches tall. We're planting them around bed edges, any place that we have good sun, good sunny space, and there's a bare spot in the garden. One of these can go in. The seed isn't very expensive. They germinate readily, so it's just something we can pop in here and there in the garden, be showy all summer. Pollinators absolutely love. And then we have the Profusion Double Deep Salmon, Profusion Double Hot Cherry, Profusion Apricot, Profusion Fire, and then our favorite Zahara one is the Double Raspberry Ripple. I wish I had actually had 2 packs of these. We only have one. I don't know how many seeds. Not many seed actually in this pack. This Double Raspberry Ripple is just fantastic. It kind of changes colors during the season. It starts off kind of a hotter pink with a little bit of white, and later in the summer it's white with a little bit of pink. A really, really interesting flower, and probably one of the more asked about flowers when we're shooting video content out here in the garden during the summer months. So you've got your seed, you have a spot out in the garden that's full sun, that's got good air movement. You're starting your seed this way or outdoors or direct seeding, however. Once they're up, there's a little bit of maintenance to think about during the summertime. I consider zinnias to be pretty drought tolerant, whether they're direct seeded or from started inside, however, but they're not going to perform at their optimum best without giving them some additional water during the summertime. It's one of those things where you will get a plant, the plant will grow and it will flower some, but it will not, again, be absolutely just covered in flowers and, with great foliage and look great unless you're just kind of monitoring the water some. So when they get abnormally, when it gets a little dry here, we do water our zinnias occasionally. If they're in containers, you're probably watering them a little bit more. Fertilizer, we will, when our annual borders go in around our turf areas and any annuals we're putting in the ground, they're going to get a little bit of compost, and they're also going to get some sort of flower tone, some sort of organic fertilizer for flowering things. Whether or not we're going to refertilize those beds will just be how we're just paying attention to it. So June, July, August come around. If it seems like our annuals aren't performing at their peak, or I'm going to analyze what's going on with them. I'm not giving them enough water. That could be the main thing. After that, I might give them a little bit of additional fertilizer, but I don't push and push and push them. I find that if you do some good bed prep with compost, you really just don't need a whole lot of additional fertilizer. I don't think we've refertilized our annual borders in here in the last 2 years at all. We've just done our initial fertilizing when they went in and our compost. So again, monitor it. If they're underperforming, it may be a water issue or it may be a fertilizer issue. Pruning, we will especially our Zinnia elegans go in the ground, we will pinch them. So they're going to come up in these trays. They're probably about this tall 4 weeks from now. When they go in the ground, we might let them initiate a little bit of growth, get themselves rooted in just a hair. When they start to grow, we will go in and pinch the tops out of them, and that will create some additional branching very low in the plant. And so it creates a much fuller plant. If I don't do that, I tend to get a stalk up about 24 inches before they're splitting and dividing and producing flowers, and they're just very, very naked down at the base. Midsummer, this is where things can get a little bit interesting. Our dwarf varieties like the Zahara series and the Profusion series, we just give them a haircut in the middle of summer. So we'll go through with a pair of head shears and literally just almost take like a third of the plant and cut them back, and that will keep them full and blooming heavily. We do not prune all of our annuals at the same time, though. I don't want to cut them all back and not have the pollinators have flowers. So we might do all the front garden one day and maybe a week later do the back garden, so there's always some flowering in some part of the garden for the pollinators that are coming along and hummingbirds and other things that are coming along. Our giants, I keep saying salvia, but Zinnia elegans, the larger growing ones, for us here in the southeast, where we have a very long summer growing season, from April 15th pretty much, or April 20th or so, all the way to pretty much, the end of October, these can get a little bit tired on us. And so we'll typically see either by midsummer some powdery mildew showing up in them or some Zinnia blight showing up in them, which is a spotting on the leaf. In the areas that we grow our giant zinnias, we have underplanted them with lantana, and that lantana takes a little while longer every year to get going. It's usually about the middle of June before they're up and really flowering. So by that time the zinnias are up big and tall and in full flower, and we just kind of take out the big zinnias toward the end of summer. That's how we've chosen to do it. Another option is to start a second round of zinnias. So we can do some now here in mid-March. We could come back in the middle of June and start another round and use those to replace the ones that are fading. Those of you in northern climates and shorter areas where it doesn't get as hot, maybe not quite as humid, your giant zinnias are probably going to last all summer without much of an issue. But for us, they do tend to fade on us. We can try to cut them in half to rejuvenate them, but I find that just having them either underplanted with new zinnias or some other perennial is the way to go on that. And that's pretty much all the maintenance we do. Almost no fertilizing. We water when they need water, and you know, we cut them occasionally just to keep them fuller. And that's pretty much it. They are one of the most rewarding things in the garden with very little input. So again, zinnias are just one of our main go-to annual plants for inviting pollinators into the garden every spring, summer, and fall with very little maintenance. What's your go-to annual flower for pollinators in your garden? Thanks for watching.